happy to share with you a little bit about some of the work I've been doing. Jeanette reached out to me and asked if I could talk a bit about some of the research that I've been working on and what I know is kind of important in the field. So I thought I'd kind of go over some of the work that I've been doing and maybe answer questions if there are any and see how what people are learning about in this world, in this field. Sorry. So let's see. Some of you may have met me in the past. I'm not sure who's in the room, but I think this is one of the important questions for all adoptees. For people in general, we're all interested in figuring out our identities and who we are, but I think it's a really essential question for adoptees, and it's where I started my career and where I continue to have a lot of interest. The questions about what labels you use for yourself. So these are the labels that I use for myself, which include adoptee, which is a prominent one, but I'm also Chinese, I'm a professor, I'm from Hong Kong, I'm a New Yorker. All of those things describe who I am, and those impact the way I look at things like identity. But I also recognize that identity is also something that changes throughout our lifespan. It's a lifelong process. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what I plan to talk about today in the 25 minutes or so we have together. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the goals and ethics I have around my research, and then familiarize you a bit with some of the projects that I've been working on, and recent publications, past publications that may be of interest. So in terms of goals and projects and ethics, I think one of the challenges in doing research is always trying to represent whatever targeted community you're studying in as accurate and authentic way as possible. And that may be particularly challenging given the representativeness of your sample, how we reach people, who we reach, etc. So the internet has changed that quite a bit and has allowed us far greater reach. But we also know that plenty of the people we would like to study who are affected by adoption may never choose to participate in a study. So we are always trying to make sure that we are representing all the voices as well as possible, and recognizing that adoptees are sort of an overstudied, over-targeted group. And so many of the adult adoptees you've met probably have participated in numerous studies. That's not typical for your general population. Most folks haven't participated in any studies. So to think about how we can make sure that we are representing their voices and their experience as well is an important goal for me. That includes recognizing the researcher's positionality. So for me, my positionality as an adult transracial international adoptee is a important identity in the research that I do. I'm also an adoptive parent of an international adoptee. I'm also a woman. I'm also Chinese American, and all of those identities impact the research and perhaps my positionality. So it's really important to be aware of how that may impact a variety of factors, from the people who may choose to participate in my research, whether they see me as part of the community or not, whether they trust me as a researcher, also maybe even how I might interpret my findings. So I think that's an important place to start. So with respect to my current work, I always like to start with statistics, because I think, I'm sure most of you probably seen these statistics, heard them at some other point, either during this conference or in the past. But the estimate that 60% of Americans have a direct connection to adoption, I think, is an important one. More than half people have some half of the people in the US have some sort of connection. And we also know that there's over 2 million adopted children under the age of 18 as of the last census that reported those numbers. And hopefully with the 2020 census, we'll have more up-to-date numbers shortly. The total number of adopted people, including adults, is really hard to estimate. The best guess is about 2% of children are adopted, but estimates of all adoptees range from 5 to 7 million people in the US. We know that private domestic adoption and foster care are equally largely processed, and that international makes up about 25% of adoptions, at least in 2007. And an important number to recognize too is that 40% of all adoptions in the US are transracial. And of those, about 84% of international adoptions are transracial. So this 40%, most international adoptions are transracial. So in that 40%, that includes those transracial adoptions as well. And if, please, I also invite you to ask questions. I will try and see that they're there when they pop up. Feel free to jump in with questions along the way. So one of the things that's really influenced me over time has been my interest in race, discrimination, microaggressions, prejudice, all of those factors. We know bias in general impacts the way we see the world, that we have certain experiences and those can really impact the way we filter information. And transracial adoptees have this unique experience of being people of color in largely often white families. And so I was very interested in understanding how the experiences of being people of color in these families may impact identity and other factors in their lives. So one of the projects that is now, it seems like it's not so recent, but I started writing about this and presenting on this in 2010, looking at microaggressions. So this is the title of a paper that was published in 2016, Do You Know Your Real Parents and Other Adoption Microaggressions. This idea of microaggressions is something that most people have heard about now, I think. The idea of subtle insults, slights, invalidations that can happen on a regular basis, daily or even more frequently, like hour by hour. They can be unintentional and they can seem like compliments, but still send messages that are invalidating or hurtful or insulting. I applied that idea to adoption, and here's an example of what that might look like.
Your baby is so sweet. Is she from Ethiopia? She looks just like the girl my sister brought home from there. Did you have to go there to get her? Hi. I don't believe we've met. I'm Sandra. What's your name? Oh, she's so cute. How old was she when you got her? She came to us at 2 months. Oh, that's wonderful. You know, sometimes they keep them in orphanages. I know a lot of them have problems. Was she in an orphanage? I don't believe I caught your name. So, where did you get her? She was born in New York. Where did you get your children? Oh, so was her mother addicted to drugs? I read recently that is not as bad as they used to think. You are lucky. She does not have ADHD or anything, does she? Was your mother addicted to drugs? Do you have a learning disability? You know you did a wonderful thing by saving her. You should be happy to talk about it with every random stranger you encounter as you go about your day. We didn't save her. We just wanted to raise a kid, and you couldn't have your own. Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, at least you got a cute one. Thanks for making a lot of assumptions and belittling my relationship with my child while objectifying her at the same time. Have a great day.
So a lot of adoptees are familiar with, and adoptive parents, people in the constellation in general are familiar with those kinds of questions. They didn't always have a name for describing what they were. When Daryl Wing Sue and colleagues revitalized the idea of microaggressions in 2007, they identified a variety of themes that typified racial microaggressions. And those include all of these that are listed here. There are 4 different types of, actually microfictions is not one that Daryl Wing Sue talked about. They talked about 3 different types of microaggressions: microinvalidations, microinsults, and microassaults. And these are some of the themes. So alien in your own land is something that a lot of international adoptees get asked about, is where are you from? And oh, you speak English so well. And those kinds of questions. The question around anything that might emphasize racial insults or invalidations that can be very subtle in nature. So in their paper, they described and gave examples of some of these racial microaggressions. So colorblindness is a very common one. When I look at you, I don't see color, or America is a melting pot. There's only one race, the human race. These kinds of microaggressions send messages that deny the experience of people of color. They emphasize assimilation and deny the individuals a racial cultural being. So these are the different types. I know this is going quickly, but those papers are pretty well known, and there's lots of examples online of microaggressions that people talk about and experience. So when applying this to adoption, which as I said, I presented about it in 2010, talking about the fact that adoptees and their families get asked questions that are microaggressive in nature, or get comments that have not really been articulated well. So we know about stigma and adoption, but what we didn't know about was how to refer to all of those kinds of questions. Are we supposed to be answering those questions? What do those questions or comments communicate to us about adoption, about our families, about our identities? So I think there are 4 different types of adoption microaggressions that communicate stigma that's related to things like problems that adoptees will have, or the idea that adoptees should be grateful and adoptive parents are rescuers, and assumptions about each member of the triad. There's stereotypes about abandonment issues, lucky adoptees, even the idea that birth parents are promiscuous or somehow self-sacrificing and angelic in some way. But either way, any type of these microaggressions still communicate that adoption is somehow deficient. So with these 4 different types of microaggressions, the micro assaults, like the old-fashioned explicit attack, calling someone a bastard or illegitimate or forcing teens to relinquish children born out of wedlock. Those are kind of obvious micro assaults. The subtler ones, though, come in the form of invalidations and insults. And so these micro invalidations refer to when adoptees are asked who their real parents are, or birth parents are asked to just get on with their lives and move forward, and they'll forget that it ever happened. Or even messages that birth parents shouldn't feel grief or loss, and that they weren't fit as parents. These invalidations can be verbal and nonverbal, and as I said before, they may be unintentional. So when people ask these questions, they may mean no harm, but they still are sending these messages that can be very invalidating and very harmful to the targets. So micro insults are similar in that they are subtle, rude, demeaning, insensitive comments that show some of the beliefs that the perpetrator may unconsciously hold around adoption. So they may not be aware that they're snubbing people or insulting people with their communications. So one of them that I think about is the idea that adoptees are rescued from poor countries and are given better, or as we might think of it, wealthier lives. And that's explained in one of my one of the themes for the adoption microaggressions. And the 4th type is something that I added to the idea of microaggressions, and that's called adoption microfictions. And this really refers to the altered stories and histories that are often inaccurate or hidden completely. News stories that are fabricated, partial truths, all of those things that we know often can happen in adoption. So sometimes those truths are altered purposefully, sometimes accidentally. Either way, a lot of times the truth and the real history of the adopted person is hidden from them and withheld from them. Even things like closed records can create microfictions. A lot of adoptees, especially domestic adoptees in the US, report being told that their birth parents died in car accidents, which is an example of a microfiction. This fiction that these loving birth parents couldn't raise you, so therefore you're available, without giving and creating these orphans, as opposed to recognizing that sometimes things like poverty, inequity, all of these other social forces may be very much contributing to the availability of children for adoption. So the different themes that I described in this are listed here. And as I said, we don't have time to go over them all, but you can see that I tried to make the titles pretty illustrative of the microaggression. So I have a few examples I'll share with you. So biology is best refers to the idea of the superiority of biological ties. And one of the kinds of microaggressions someone might experience is, I vaguely remember, somebody was trying to be mean, saying, well, your real mother didn't want you, or who are your real parents? Where are your real parents? Bad seed adoptee is something that's been in narrative literature media for a long time. And the expectation that adoptees are relinquished because of some deficit that they may hold, some bad genes or some other problem that led to their being relinquished. So you're not wanted because your mommy didn't want you. Commerce in adoption and foster care are other kinds of microaggressions, referring to the industry of adoption. So even without anyone saying anything, having different fees for different racial groups of children can communicate that microaggression. And shameful birth parents is another example that refers to birth parents as somehow of low character or unsuitable for parenthood. So, and then I'll just end with the cultural philanthropy is much like we talked about with the idea of American exceptionalism, and that kids will get better lives by going to Western countries than they would in their birth countries, because wealthier and American opportunities are positioned as a better situation for children. So that's the stuff on microaggressions. We're currently doing a project on, we've interviewed birth parents and we've interviewed adoptees and adoptive parents, and are further exploring some of the microaggressions they share with us. So another project that was published quite a while ago, but now is something that I'm continuing to work with. I'm working with a few colleagues on putting some sort of measure together to try and create a quantitative measure to explore reculturation and adoptee identity. This really refers to the concept of adoptees as immigrants, and what that might, how that immigration experience leads to the way in which they develop their cultural identities, and then if they seek to, ultimately may reclaim their birth cultural identities, which are lost upon adoption. So when a child is born in another country and then placed in a foreign family, then they have to, their forced assimilation is required for them to survive in that family, which means they also lose their birth cultural experience. We call it reculturation because there was no term to describe how someone acculturates to a minority culture. So when adoptees who were internationally adopted immigrated and then assimilated into the white culture of their adoptive parents, when they're adults, they may seek to reclaim that birth culture. And there's no way, that's hard to do it when the culture is a minority culture and must be sought out in much more purposeful ways. So ultimately, what it looks like is there's this image in the paper that describes the way enculturation stops upon placement in an adoptive family, and then assimilation has to begin to enable the adoptee to survive. And then at various points, they may seek activities that will help them learn and grow and become somewhat competent in enacting their birth culture. So I'm looking at the time. I don't think I have time to go into great detail about that. But other projects, so while you know that identity has been a big question for me, I've also am a clinician. And so one of the things that I've seen in my clinical practice is the prevalence of substance use disorders. And with my research team of doctoral and master's students at Montclair State University, we've started putting together a adoption-focused substance use disorder prevention curriculum. We are trying to recognize that a lot of substance use disorders are higher in international adoptees than in the non-adopted population, sometimes up to 5 times higher. And there's not much attention, however, given in all of the substance use prevention programs. So we believe that some focus on adoption needs to happen. So we've been working on that project and have put together some what I think will be helpful materials. I'm also working with 2 colleagues, Doctors Ann Farina and Holly McGinnis, on working on 2 different projects, one on an evidence gap map and a systematic review of clinical interventions. Both of these projects are will be forthcoming in Campbell collaborations. And we're excited about them because they allow us to represent the ways in which the kind of research we know that occurs or does not occur as well on adult, transracial, and international adoptees. And then some recent publications that I've worked on. As you can see, it's all in adoption, but it sort of spans different or hits different notes. So another adoptee and I, Kit Myers, and I worked on a project on a gathering that occurred in Hong Kong for adult Hong Kong adoptees. Many of the Hong Kong adoptees are in their 50s, 60s. And so it's one of the first studies of an older generation of adoptees, and many of them returning to their birth country for one of the first times. This other project is something that I worked on with some of my students on searching for contact with birth relatives. So we looked at search facilitation and what training people do or do not have in trying to help facilitate contact between adoptees and birth parents often. We found that basically very little formal training occurs, and that which does occur is often not seen as helpful. Many of the search facilitators are self-trained. And we know that with the advent of the internet and DNA testing, many folks are not getting much help in search facilitation. One of the most, I think, important findings from that study was that the search facilitators who responded to our survey reported that they see the emotional needs of the searchers as very primary, but most of them recommended counseling but did not require it for the searchers. A study that I did with some colleagues, two of whom, excuse me, Doug Shadell and Ron Morgan, both of whom are adult adoptees, but who did not learn of their adoptions until they were adults. We decided together to work on this project on delaying adoption disclosure. It was a really interesting study in that the findings indicated that the older folks were, and it goes with what we might expect, let me just say that, but the older folks were, when they learned of their adoptions, the more distress it caused them, especially when you account for the different kinds of coping mechanisms that may be used by adults versus adolescents versus children. And what we in particular found was that finding out that one's adopted after the age of 3 is already going to cause distress in adoptees. So essentially, if you remember being told that you were adopted, it's likely that that's going to have some impact and some distress on one's functioning. Those who felt like they had always known that they were adopted and had no specific memory of learning it reported the least distress. Some other publications that are older, but I thought I might mention, include a study of adult adoptees' counseling satisfaction. And we found that a lot of adoptees reported that their counselors didn't address or emphasize adoption in their counseling experiences. But those who did, even just a little bit or a lot of emphasis on adoption, significantly increased satisfaction for adoptees who went to therapy. I share this next study on culture camp because one of the things I'd always thought was interesting was that culture camp might be an immersion experience. That's what we send kids to culture camps for, so that they can learn about their Korean culture, their Chinese culture, their Indian culture. Yet, what my study found in this pre and post test study is that essentially, I think that the culture camp isn't really an immersion experience. It's much more like a cultural socialization experience for adoptees. So I think it's an adoptee socialization experience. And that's what function it ends up serving. And this last citation is for the first project that I did on adoption. And it sort of helps relate my work on reculturation to this work on the cultural racial identity model for adoptees. I'm happy to take questions. I know I'm kind of at my time. I don't think I see any. So if there's anyone who has any questions, I'm happy to stay on a bit and answer any questions. If anyone has any questions, please let me know. I can also unmute you if you want to ask it verbally. So I think I can. You're welcome. Thank you so much. So thank you for attending. And if you don't have any questions, thank you and have a wonderful day. I hope it was helpful. Good. Thank you so much. So I see a question, why did I get into this field? Well, so as I mentioned, I think I mentioned that I'm an adult adoptee, adopted from Hong Kong. When I was in graduate school, I was really compelled by issues around identity. When I learned about racial and cultural identity, mind you, this is in the mid 90s, I was very struck by that because I knew that from my experience, I had most related to my experience as a minority person and a person of color, which I thought was really important for me in my identity. And I was curious about how other people made sense of their identities, given that most adoptees, international transracial adoptees, were raised by parents who were white often, and often didn't have much exposure to birth culture. So what I looked at was making a distinction between race and culture so that people could sort of better understand what that, so we could better depict how people make sense of their identities. Hi, Rhonda Rorda. I haven't talked to you in a long time. Thank you so much for everything. I really, I love doing this work and I would love to catch up with you sometime. Thank you for attending. It's great to see your name here. Thank you. So I have a question from Lisa N, who asked how the research is used. How is the info shared with the community? She's new. So I am a professor at a university, so much of my research is published in academic journals. But I've also, as I mentioned, am in private practice. So I live in New York City. That's where my practice is. And I've worked with a lot of folks at different adoption community events. So I've participated in some of the camps that exist and try and disseminate the information in that way. So we hope that research is getting used by practitioners. I organize a conference called the Adoption Initiative Conference that's going to take place actually in October 2021. We're not sure if it'll be virtual or live, but possibly some combination. And in those kinds of events, and like this event, we try and disseminate some of the findings and ideas that we're talking about, so that practitioners and those personally affected in the triad or constellation can use the research in their own lives. I see a question about whether BIPOC is a new term. I don't know that it's a new term, but it's a more recently used term. So probably in the past, maybe 5 years or so that I've seen it more pop up more often. Black, Indigenous, people of color, for those who don't know what BIPOC refers to. Any other questions? I'm happy to answer them. I'm happy to have a dialogue as well. Ah, Rich, let me see. I can figure out how to let you talk. Can't find my, there it is. Okay. You want to talk, Rich?
Sure, thank you. I'm on a cell phone, so I think my typed question might not have shown up.
Oh yeah, I didn't see anything from you.
Yeah, Jeanette explained that cell phone users are second-class citizens at this conference, and I just want to lodge a formal protest. I'm joking.
That's good. I have no power here. So
that's right. Just re-traumatizing the adoptees. I have a question because I am intrigued and interested in the term microaggressions as it applies to the world of adoption. I think we've all experienced them, and they're real, and they generate feelings. And at the same time, I kind of struggle with what is the balance of, as an individual, managing it with understanding that the world is just full of ignorant, insensitive people, and how offended should we be by microaggressions, maybe is the right question.
Okay, it's a great question, actually. I think the thing with microaggressions that's really important to understand is that not only have we all been targets of microaggressions, we've all committed them too. And so because we're all committing them, it's impossible not to. As much as we might try and be as sensitive and cautious as possible, it's inevitable. I think the important thing is to be open to dialogue about it, open to being humble enough to learn where we might have gone wrong and how we can make changes in the future. So in terms of being offended by them, I think it's very personal, it depends. So for example, I might experience some of the same microaggressions over and over and over. While it's sometimes frustrating, it's not necessarily offensive. It only sort of emphasizes my point that these exist, right? So certain microaggressions are more common than others. One of the things in our research that we found is that I had not initially put sacrificial birth parents as one of the themes of my in the model, in the framework. And through the analysis of interviews, we added that microaggression because it was clear that birth parents were positioned in that way. And so we found that very meaningful. I don't know, does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. And some of this may just what bubbles around in my mind is how much life is hard enough without stopping to analyze every microaggression that comes my way, but that's maybe just how I'm wired.
Well, I mean, we don't have to be bothered. I think the thing is they're going to send messages, and sometimes if we don't acknowledge that the messages are being sent, we can just feel bad about ourselves. We could start to internalize the stigma, and that's when it becomes harmful psychologically and interpersonally. So getting that constant message that you're defective as an adoptee without even recognizing that that's a microaggression can make you start to believe that, which can only then contribute to some of the distress that you might be feeling.
Yeah, important distinction. Thank you.
Yes, of course, anytime. Any other questions or thoughts? Lisa, yes, I'm going to try and unmute you if I can get it to work. Let's see, where's my cursor? There, you should be able to talk.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. I'm really interested in research about adoption, and I know for me, becoming a mom brought up a lot of my own, struggles that had kind of been suppressed. And I was wondering, do you know if there's research on the impact of motherhood and that developmental transition for adoptees?
I think there's some stuff that I think J. Ron Kim did some work on that. I know that there's a book that I don't know that it was real research, like it was empirical research as much as more an anthology. I know there was I think it was called, what was it called? Someone else might know the name of it, but it was about adoptees becoming parents. And I don't remember the exact name of it.
Oh yeah, parenting as adoptees.
Yes.
That was one of the few resources I did find on it, and I'm actually interested in potentially doing research myself on it, just because I have never heard of it. Kind of going that direction later down the line. But yeah, I knew going into it, it would be something significant, and I feel like more resources would help.
I absolutely agree. I think it's an understudied area. Another understudied area, I think, is looking at the siblings of adoptees and the children of adoptees. Because I think not only is parenting as an adoptee a factor, but the children of adoptees grow up with some questions too that they have. So for example, I'm teaching a class on adoption, counseling the adoption triad, it's called. I created this course about 15 years ago, and it's a graduate course for students who are going to be mental health counselors. And in my class, I have a couple of students who are the children of adoptees. Both of their parents were late discovery adoptees. And so they have obviously lots of questions, some of which they feel able to ask their parents and some of which they feel unable to ask. So I think
thank you.
Yeah, of course. Of course. Any other questions? No, no questions? Rhonda, do you want to, are you there still? How's it going with you? Do you have anything you want to, I'm allowing you to talk if you want. Let's see. I think I am. Let's see if I can get it to work. There, you should be unmuted.
Yes, can you hear me?
I can. How are you, Rhonda?
I am doing great, and I apologize I had to drop in a little later in your presentation. But I do want to restate what I said. Thank you so much for your great research. I'm still, as an adoptee, always a little frustrated because there's, relatively speaking, minimal research on transracial adoption, on transnational adoption. So as adoptees, I think we're still struggling in the process of reunion. Like, I connected with my birth family, but it was organic. And I know there's some research out there, and therapy services that I did utilize, but I just think it's sporadic, and so many people don't have access to this great information. So I'm always excited when I can hear of current research, hear of work on this topic. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, we, I think you're right that it's, I think the challenge with publishing in academic journals also is that a lot of folks don't have access to them if they're not in school or working in a university, and they're very expensive to order by each article. So what I encourage folks to do is just email the author, and they will usually send you a copy of it. So
okay, yeah. That's a good strategy.
Yes, yeah. I mean, people email me a lot for articles. I'm happy to send them. So
okay,
but you're right that some of them are not as accessible. Some of them are maybe not always getting exactly what you want them to study, or the way you were hoping they were going to lay things out. So even my own work, sometimes I'm frustrated with the limitations that are present. There's things I'd love to be able to study that I can't.
Yeah,
and things like that.
Yeah, and one of the topics, and I don't know if someone is working on it, is the fragmentation of adoptive parent relationships due to colorblind policy, or due to not being flexible, because that's a real thing. And I know that I struggle with that. And I think it has a lot to do with the narratives in which adoptees walk into, the lack of understanding of the complexity and the context of, in my case, transracial adoption, and the allegiance to, I look at white parents who are adopting kids of color. There's an allegiance to the parents, white adoptive parents, political, social constructs. And so the adoptee, if they're going to really do the work in embracing their identity, understanding their full worth, it can be a lonely road.
You're 100% right. I think that's a really important point. It's funny because when I think about what research does exist, we look at like the adoptees' experiences of discrimination. We might look at communicative openness, how much their parents are able to talk about adoption. But and then I've done some work with Ellen Pinderhughes on microaggressions that adoptive parents might acknowledge that their kids experience, but not necessarily the ones that they realize that they are committing. So,
Right.
yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, we can't even really talk about what's going on politically and socially in society when the conversations within our own adoptive families haven't been had. So I can even have family members, extended family members, promote Black Lives Matter. But if an extended family member called me an N-word 20 years ago and the family is minimizing that, making excuses about that person, how do you reconcile how you're being perceived by them? Do you see what I'm saying? It's so deep.
It is.
And I almost think that the conversations around race, around how we view the community in which our children are coming from, how we view their birth family, are so important to be had even before we can tackle societal issues as a family unit.
It's interesting, Rhonda, that you're talking about this, because in my clinical practice, I work with a lot of adoptees around this very topic, where they know which extended, and it's usually extended family members, but some within their nuclear family as well, who are Trump supporters, for example, or where they feel really uncomfortable at those family gatherings because they know that not everyone's on the same page. And I agree that it's so in the work I do training adoptive parents, I talk about their tendency to ask the adoptee to accommodate the inappropriateness of extended family instead of asking the inappropriate family to make the changes.
The onus is not on them. This is the thing. And again, I believe in adoption. I believe children need families. But when we look at this, and I hope I don't offend your listeners, but quote unquote experiment of adoption. Let's just put that out there. Just assume it's an experiment. The onus has always been on the shoulders of adoptees. And if we don't do this right, we commit suicide, or we walk around wounded, or we live smaller than we were born to be, because we are accommodating others instead of ourselves. That's number one. And number two, we have to, now maybe it's because I'm a fund manager, so I think money and investments and multiple streams of it. So I think a little differently than probably an empirical researcher. But there has to be an understanding of how you're going to fund yourself. If you decide that you are going to go on this journey to discover all of who you are and to embrace all of who you are, because it may go outside of what your family is willing to support emotionally, spiritually, financially. And this is that I think this is where a lot of adoptees are getting caught up, because it relies on your inner compass, how strong you are, how you are able to make money, how you're able to stand up and speak your truth.
Well, the very nature of adoption sort of inspires the idea of loyalty, partly because the expectation of gratitude is tied to it. And so many adoptees struggle to navigate that that line between maintaining the relationship and showing some level of gratitude versus being able to have a open dialogue with all the attendant criticism that might need to happen.
And this is why I say this experiment is on the shoulders of adoptees. And I think that that is horribly unfair.
Yeah, yeah. I invite any of the other folks who are in here if they want to jump into the conversation, but I know there's some of you who are listening and have not been able to participate as much. Go ahead, Rich, sorry.
No problem. Yeah, this is such an important conversation in our group here in Colorado. We talk a lot about where do we draw the lines and how do we normalize this? Because in a normal, healthy family relationship, there's an element of thankfulness is natural and good. And yet, as you're pointing out, the exponential sainthood assigned to a lot of adoptive parents and the attendant special gratitude that goes with it is a really unspoken burden that a lot of people carry. And I don't want to derail this track, but I had a quick question also. In terms of some of the research done that involves surveys for adoptees, how much do you think it is skewed by the fact that adoptees are hard to find and a lot of the same people who live in the same echo chamber tend to answer those surveys?
Probably more than we want it to be. You know, I think that it's interesting because it's also impacted by who's doing the research. I think, you know, when I know it's an adult adoptee doing a study, I might be more amenable to taking it than if it's somebody else running the study. I don't know if that's the same for you guys, but I would guess that may be true for some. I also think that there's a lot of folks who are not dialed into the networks, which is how people might find out about the studies. Also, whether the studies are funded, all of those things impact. So if there's any kind of compensation for participation, all those things I think impact. So maybe it's the echo chamber to a degree. It depends on how well it's designed and really the reach of the study, you know? So when I'm doing my work on microaggressions, I had a lot of folks who wanted to participate, which was exciting. But again, the funding issue is a really major problem because a lot of folks look at adoptees as being adopted into wealthy families and not being an issue that we need to really look at, you know, in at least funders. And so people think of adoption as a positive thing. That's the, I think, general social narrative of it. Lisa, go ahead. I see you had your hand raised too. Let's see, Lisa.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I switched devices, so thanks for unmuting me again. Yeah, I completely agree, Rhonda, with what you said about just the undue burden placed on the shoulders of adoptees, and especially transracially, you know, holding that burden within our own families and experiencing microaggressions within our own families. And yeah. Sorry, I had a question to follow up with that, but I completely blanked because I'm taking care of 2 toddlers at the same time. But I just wanted to say that, yeah, thank you, Rhonda, for sharing that. And I completely agree.
Thanks.
You are most welcome.
Yes. Anyone else have anything else they want to add? You guys have great ideas for research studies too. I think that, you know, I should say that the study on delayed discovery adoption, both of the men who I mentioned were late discovery adoptees were not academics, but they both had that experience and they were part of the adoption community and saw a need for that study. And they decided to take it into their hands and they were looking for a partner for the project. And that's how I ended up involved. I, as a transracial adoptee, don't have a lot of experience with delayed discovery of adoption, because it's pretty hard to hide adoption from transracial adoptees. But I think it ended up being such an important study because it gave us some real parameters to tell people, so that we can support what we've been telling people, which we knew instinctively was right, but had a harder time pointing to some research for.
I remembered my question, which is related to, the research and just accessibility for adoptees, because I think for me personally, it was a long road to get to this point where I feel comfortable attending an adoption conference and not feeling like I might fall apart if I step into anything that has to do with adoption. Like, I have a therapist, I am supported, by my husband and family. But I think earlier it kind of felt like if I open up that can of worms, I may just fall apart. So I think I was kind of wondering about the dissemination of information, because like I said, when I was becoming a new mom, I did kind of put my feelers out there, and I know there was an adoption institute that recently shut down, it seems like. So I was wondering if there are kind of like any in between areas. Like, I feel like books are kind of an in between area where, they're accessible, but don't require that big of an investment, and websites and things like that. So I was just wondering if there are other like institutes like that exist.
Well, the former executive director of Donaldson had started another group called National Center for Adoption Permanency, NCAP, Adam Pertman. He's can be controversial figure sometimes for folks, but he is trying to, he did really always emphasize research. And so I think that they're trying to, of course, get funding to be able to continue doing that. I think it's, you'll find a lot of it in universities, and there are definitely some bloggers out there who are doing a great job of trying to keep up with this. Like Jae-Ron Kim has a blog. There's a woman named Grace Newton who's a Chinese adult adoptee who does blogs a lot. And I think they're trying to keep up with what's coming out, but it is hard. I have trouble keeping up with it all, and it's part of my work, so the good news is that there's a lot more people doing research on adoption than there used to be. And it used to be extremely rare to have any adult adoptees doing the research. So we had the voices mostly of non-adoptees and adoptive parents in the research prior to 2000, probably. And then as I've been in my professional position, I've seen a lot of adult adoptees become academics and start to do this work, and it's very exciting. I also started a group called the Society for Adoptee Professionals in Adoption. Society for Adoptee Professionals of Color in Adoption, SOPCA. And it's mostly academics, I will say, that are trying to put out some work together. So we have a Medium post that we put together about the Amy Coney Barrett nomination and ascendance to the court, and what that means about racism and within families as well, and what people need to learn about it. So there's some of that kind of work that's not strict dissemination of research, but kind of gives a bit of a perspective that may be helpful. I don't know if that exactly fits what you're looking for.
Yeah, thank you so much. Society for Transracial Adoptee Professionals, you said?
Society for Adoptee Professionals of Color in Adoption.
Of color.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Full disclosure, I don't know if you got my message, but I'm hoping to apply to Montclair State for my PhD. And this is like before I even saw that you were on the list. I was like, wow, that's yeah, because
that's great.
I mean, I do think I work in research right now as an assistant, and it really matters who's doing the research. I can see that. And it's something that I think is really important. And yeah, I appreciate the work you've done. So thank you for sharing all this.
I did get your message, and I should note I'm in the Department of Counseling, not in clinical psych, even though I'm a psychologist. So,
Okay. That's great.
yes. Anyone else have anything they want to add before we end for today? Because I know that I think this is your lunch period, but I'm betting a lot of these people are on the East Coast who lunch is long ago. So
Just a big thank you for your work and your insight and your leadership and compassion in all this. It's such a needed field, and you're making a difference.
that really means a lot to me. Thank you so much for saying that. You know, it's really, I get a lot of energy from working with and talking with adoptees about the work, because that's who I'm trying to represent. I'm trying to represent other adoptees. And so that's what I think is needed, to have someone have a voice and have that voice be taken seriously. Because as we all know, those who are adoptees know that a lot of us are kind of seen as children forever. And so to sort of represent a professional disposition is important. Thank you, though.
Anecdotal to what you just said about being seen as children, I was interviewed for a newspaper story a few years ago about legislation here in Colorado. And the reporter and a photographer came to my place, and I opened the door, and he said, I'm here to take a photograph and do a story about an adoptee. And he was looking down at my knees.
Yep. We're always children. It's a fascinating thing. So any last questions before we go, or comments? Well, good luck, everyone. It was wonderful getting to do this presentation. I really want to thank Jeanette for reaching out to me, and for all of you for attending. I hope everything is, that you learned something and that it's inspiring for you in some way or helpful for you in some way. So have a wonderful rest of your weekend and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks. Thank you, Laura. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close the session. Everyone have a wonderful day, and take good care.